couple of weeks ago, I posted a video on Daniel Ricciardo and the speculation regarding his future, as at the time it was a bit unclear as to what was going to happen with his future in Formula One. And sure enough, just a couple of days later, it was announced that Ricciardo would be leaving RB before the end of the 2024 season, and it very much looks like it's not just the end of his time at VCARB, it's also the end of his time in Formula One. There's been quite a large outpouring of emotion from fans over Ricciardo's departure, because I think it's pretty clear that obviously we all know that Ricciardo was a fan favourite. He was one of the most popular drivers on the grid. Regardless of whether his performances weren't up to scratch, I think everyone wanted to see him go out on a high, at least get a send-off, which is obviously is a shame that he will not get to do that, and that his final race in Singapore really was a bit of a disaster, which obviously I discussed in that video. So given that the announcement was made after I posted that video, I thought now would be a good time to sort of talk about Ricciardo and his career, but not sort of reflect on his whole career and all the victories and all the high points. In particular, I thought I'd reflect on a particular moment, probably the defining moment of Ricciardo's career, something that everyone still talks about to this day, and it's something that is quite hotly debated among fans as to whether he made the right or wrong decision at the time. And of course, I'm talking about his decision to leave Red Bull for Renault in 2018. So let's look at this particular moment in a bit more depth and see how it unravelled. Let's look at the decision first of all. So it happened during the 2018 summer break. Formula One had just finished the Hungarian Grand Prix, and just a few days later this huge bombshell was announced that Ricciardo had decided he was going to leave Red Bull and join Renault from 2019 onwards. At the time, this was a huge shock. No one had expected Ricciardo to leave Red Bull. He was expected to re-sign. His contract was up at the end of the season. He had been sort of flirting and had talks with other teams, mainly Ferrari and Mercedes. They'd expressed their interest in signing him. Obviously that never happened, and talks never really progressed enough for him to be considered for a seat in those respective teams. Instead, he held talks with Renault, and those talks clearly progressed to the point where he decided he was going to take the decision to leave Red Bull and head up the Renault team in 2019. So why had Ricciardo taken the decision at this point in his career when he was clearly winning races, performing at a high level, and clearly was loved and respected and valued quite highly at Red Bull? Well, there are a couple of pointers, and the first one is that I think at that point in time he sort of really wanted and kind of enjoyed the idea of having a team that was built around him where he could head up a project. I think although Red Bull valued him, I think Ricciardo didn't really feel that. He almost felt that he was actually devalued compared to his teammate Max Verstappen. And the traces to why he felt devalued compared to Verstappen can go all the way back to 2016, when in fact Verstappen was hired by Red Bull after 5 races in that 2016 season to replace Daniel Ricciardo, and won obviously on debut at the Spanish Grand Prix, becoming the youngest ever winner in Formula One. With Verstappen joining the team, this is where it slowly began to unravel and almost began a chain reaction to Ricciardo's departure just a couple of years later. I mean, at the time there was no reason for Ricciardo to feel as though he wasn't as good as driver as Max was. I mean, he beat him in both 2016 and 2017 in the championship. He finished ahead of him in the standings, and actually when you look back, Ricciardo's results were actually probably more impressive and more consistent than what Max's was at the time. Although they scored 3 victories apiece during those 2 seasons, Ricciardo was a lot more regularly on the podium than Max was, mixing it with the top 2 teams at the time, which were Mercedes and Ferrari. But even though Max at the time wasn't the driver that he is today, who is clearly the finished article, he's an absolute megastar, he was clearly a bit of a rough diamond back then, who was kind of quick but at the same time quite frantic and chaotic on track. It was clearly Red Bull's future. Red Bull valued him extremely highly and saw him as a clear star in the making, and of course they have clearly been proved right. One crucial piece of the puzzle in Ricciardo's departure happened a year before, in 2017, when Verstappen signed a contract extension with Red Bull that not only meant that he would be staying with Red Bull for an extra year, it also meant that he was on a higher salary than Ricciardo, which I suppose at the time Ricciardo probably would have viewed that as a bit of favouritism towards Max's side, when he would have probably been thinking, hey, I'm performing just as well as Max, why are you now giving him a contract extension with a higher salary when I'm doing just as good a job? But it wouldn't just be this that would have an impact on Ricciardo's thinking for his future in Formula One. It was also the fact that Red Bull had announced that they would be changing engine suppliers from 2019. They would be moving from Renault to join Honda as a works engine partner, after it felt that clearly Honda had made good progress, solid progress during the year. In 2018 it was obviously powering its sister team Toro Rosso at the time, and the results with Toro Rosso had been quite encouraging, hence why Red Bull decided to take that chance and join Honda. So with Verstappen on a better contract and a higher salary, and given that Honda weren't yet proven as an engine manufacturer, Ricciardo made the decision that he was going to leave Red Bull and join Renault. And in fact, when speaking in the Singapore paddock after the race, he actually was asked about this question regarding his decision to leave Red Bull and join Renault, and how he sort of felt about it, if he had any regrets. And Ricciardo actually admitted that it wasn't his smartest decision. And when you look at it, it probably was the wrong decision when you sort of take a step back and look at it as a whole. But you got to remember at the time that even during that Renault period, he did 2 seasons there in 2019 and 2020, Ricciardo was still a top driver, who was still performing at a high level. He completely outclassed his 2 teammates, Nico Hülkenberg and Esteban Ocon, in those respective seasons, and he scored 2 podiums. So all of this brings me on to the ultimate question, which is, was Ricciardo right to leave Red Bull, or should he have in fact stayed? Well, in my opinion, I think he absolutely made the right decision to leave Red Bull for Renault, and that's because you've got to look at this, you've got to look at the sort of the bigger picture, and that's Red Bull, first of all, isn't the team that it has been over the recent years in the dominant period that it's enjoyed with Verstappen. And at the time, Honda hadn't yet to prove itself to be a competitive engine manufacturer. It had gone through so much turmoil during its 3 years with McLaren that there wasn't enough signs yet that it was going to get everything right, that it was going to develop an engine that was competitive in the same threshold as Mercedes and Ferrari. And on top of that, there's also the question around whether he would have still been competitive alongside Max, would he have still been able to have beat him every now and again. And I think, given how the 2018 season was going, Ricciardo had the upper hand in the first 6 races where Max was still crashing and still making silly mistakes, and then from Canada onwards he really put Ricciardo in the shade and started to beat him a lot more consistently. And I think that was a sign that had Ricciardo stayed on from 2019, that's the way the dynamic was going. Max was going to start getting the upper hand on Ricciardo a lot more consistently and clearly be the number 1 driver in that team. So the point I'm effectively trying to make is that had Ricciardo decided he was going to stay on at Red Bull and stayed on for another, let's say, 2 or 3 years, that this move actually would have worked out well. It actually would have paid off. There's every chance that it could have worked out even less so than ultimately his career did pan out to be. Ultimately, he took a risk in chasing success and it didn't pay off. That's just the way the cookie crumbles. It can go either one way or the other, and in this case it went the wrong way for him. If you look at Lewis Hamilton, for example, he is a clear and obvious example as to how a career-defining decision can ultimately work out. Everyone said that he made a critical mistake in joining Mercedes from McLaren in 2013, and look how it's turned out. He's now a 7-time world champion and he holds all of the records in Formula 1. While ultimately it has had consequences for Ricciardo in terms of how his career panned out, he only won 1 more Grand Prix after that with McLaren at Monza, and he didn't really have a car as competitive as what he did at Red Bull. You also have to look at it as it hasn't really panned out well for Red Bull either, because they've never really replaced him. They've obviously had Gasly, Albon, Perez all in that car since, and they've never really performed as well as Ricciardo did when he was alongside Verstappen, not just in terms of the head-to-head and the stats a lot compared to Verstappen, but also how he was able to extract performance out of the car. Ricciardo really was at his best, at his peak when he was at Red Bull. It doesn't just reflect badly on Ricciardo's decision making, it also reflects on the difficulties Red Bull has had in replacing him. It is a shame that this decision will effectively define Ricciardo's career, but it does not in any way take away from the fact that Ricciardo was one of the top drivers at the time. In some cases he was the best driver on the grid, I think. Certainly in 2014 and 2016, that was when he really was something else. And if anything, it is a reminder to those who never saw Ricciardo at his peak and have only seen him during his struggles at McLaren and RB, that at one point in his career Ricciardo was one of the top drivers on the Formula 1 grid. So there you have it. Feel free to leave your comments down below on today's topic, and also if you are new around here, don't forget to like the video and to subscribe to the channel. Thanks for watching guys, and I will see you in the next one. Goodbye.